And welcome to all of our guests watching from our school community and wider beyond that. We know we've had a huge uptake in our lectures so far this year, especially now they've gone online and going live. And throughout the whole COVID-19 situation, we do find new ways of accessing information and actually new ways of coming together to share thought and disseminate ideas. And clearly the platforms we're using now with the live team events have reached thousands of people around the world, as well as in the UK as well. And I think today we're really privileged to have a very key topic to talk about, and one that I know there's been great interest in from the students, not only at our school but outside of here as well. And as you'll be quite familiar with our sort of structure so far, we're going to welcome a guest into our Great Hall lecture live, and then we'll have a quick chat about who they are. And our guest today, we're really privileged to be with us. We actually have Dr. I'll try and pronounce it correctly. I did practice before we started. Dr. Javier Garcia Oliva.
That's brilliant. Absolutely
wonderful.
Brilliant, Mr. Show. Yeah.
How are you anyway today? You well? Everything going well for you and staying safe?
Yes, everything is brilliant, and absolutely honored to be here with all of you today. Thank you for the invitation.
So we try and get an understanding for all of our viewers out there of who you are and what you do and what brought you to this point in your academic career and obviously where you are. So could you perhaps talk about why your particular area of research is so important to you? What got you into it? And obviously you've got an exciting journey, and people might guess by your name, by your accent, that you may be at the University of Manchester, but you don't sound like a traditional Mancunian. And I won't ask you which football team you support, because I mean, is it a UK-based team or do you support perhaps an overseas team?
Yeah, refer to the football at the end of this, question. That always alienates people, but absolutely brilliant, Mr. Show, to be here. I'm an academic in law. My particular research interest is constitutional law, which has become very topical, obviously, in the last few years because of a wide range of issues such as Brexit. That's been the leading one, but we have also had fascinating discussions here in the United Kingdom and elsewhere about Scottish independence, the hypothetical independence of Catalonia, and so on. Then this is my main research interest, constitutional law. Within constitutional law, obviously, human rights is a very important part. That is why it's a pleasure to share my views about human rights with you and your pupils today. And well, it's in addition to mainstream constitutional law, my second important research interest is law and religion. And the interaction between law and religion is very appealing to me. I'm an academic lawyer, I'm not a theologian, but I also deal with the way public authorities and religious bodies collaborate with each other here in the United Kingdom and in the rest of Europe.
Wow, that's quite a broad coverage, but also I think for this particular decade of where we are right now, I mean, obviously very, very relevant for all the discussions going on. And I know that many of us will think back to, obviously, in the UK, the Brexit situation and what that means because of that. But there are a large number, of course, of historical experiences of such cases when these things happen. And you're right, I mean, human rights are an absolute sort of cornerstone of what's going on and what needs to be addressed and discussed about there. And as I'm sure you're aware, in the media, in the press as well, human rights is talked about a huge amount. But actually, I think academically studying it and understanding it, not just as a newspaper article, but understanding it thoroughly is very, very important. So I want to thank you before you start to talk about your key passion topic there. Is thank you for being with us today and for sharing it. And what I believe is a very important time to talk about this as well. So I'll hand the microphone over to you now and give you some time to talk about your main talk. And then at the end, if you're happy to take some questions from our pupils, and I will try and grill you on the topic at the end. But I think some very interesting questions too.
Many thanks, Mr. Show. The pleasure is all mine. And I have prepared, if I may, I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation, which and I'll try to be brief because I am very, very interested, obviously, in hearing from you and in learning your views about this particular subject. But the title of my presentation is as follows: Human Rights in the United Kingdom, Significance and Protection at National and International Level. Perhaps I should emphasize from the very outset that I'm going to be focusing on the legal response here in the United Kingdom. And when it comes to public law, that includes areas such as constitutional law, administrative law, and so on, we have a similar legal framework in the whole of the United Kingdom. However, for those of you who have an interest in law, you will know that if you studied private law subjects, such as property law or contract law, they will be different in other parts of the United Kingdom, certainly very different in Scotland. Therefore, when it comes to my area, human rights, we are not looking at England exclusively. We are focusing on the whole of the United Kingdom, comprising, as we all know, England, Wales, Scotland, and also Northern Ireland. Then what am I intending to discuss with you and share with you in the course of the next 30 minutes at the very most? The structure is as follows. I'm going to look at the origin of rights. When did this debate about human rights start? I think this is very important to take us through the history, however briefly. Then I'm going to look at how human rights are protected here in the United Kingdom, and I'm going to refer to the interaction between the international community and our domestic legislation, because it's quite important to see how we in the United Kingdom cooperate with European institutions and also with international institutions. And then I'm going to look at those particular human rights, how are they dealt with by here in the United Kingdom, and we're going to talk about the duties of public authorities and private bodies towards individuals. I'm going to refer at the end of my presentation to the so-called conflicts of rights, and I'll draw some conclusions at the end. In terms of the origin of rights, conversations about rights are nothing new, and we know they have taken place throughout the centuries. And I think it's absolutely fantastic to highlight that in the 13th century, in 2015, the Magna Carta was a written document which already set out rights which are very familiar to us nowadays, such as the right to a fair trial or access to justice, the right not to be imprisoned without due process, and no taxation without representation. Importantly, also, in the heart, within religious communities, the whole idea of human rights has been extremely important. Within Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they all recognize that individual human beings have rights which must be respected. And importantly, those religious bodies have always considered that rulers, those people who were in charge of the power, also had to obey the law enacted, obviously, by the divinity. There were some restrictions, therefore, to the power of kings in this world. This is a very, very basic, because we don't have enough time to discuss the historical origins, but certainly also philosophers throughout the years, throughout the centuries, have referred to this importance of human rights. But may I please just bring you with me to the 20th century. And I know we have jumped a fair bit, and I apologize for that, but I need to do it in order to conclude in half an hour. Otherwise, I would never finish. In the 20th century, we witnessed a significant amount of agreements between states which aim to protect human rights. And the most important example, the landmark example of this trend, which was particularly important after the Second World War, was the signature of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been absolutely essential for humankind. This is really, really important in 1948. But obviously, we need to ask ourselves, how are human rights upheld? How are they protected, not internationally, but in every single member state? And I think it's important, therefore, to focus on the relationship between our domestic law, here in the UK or anywhere else, and the international community. I think the most important message I need to convey and share with you is that sovereign states are free to make rules within their own jurisdictions. Then, if you like, for many purposes, international law is a bit like the pirate code in the Pirates of the Caribbean. They are more like guidelines, because when it comes to the crunch, everything is going to be very, very dependent on the will of the state, of the sovereign state. And there is a fascinating debate at the moment about what exactly a sovereign state is. The status which international agreements have within states will depend on each constitution. Here in the United Kingdom, as you all know, we don't have a codified constitution, but we have a beautiful constitution, which is what I teach here at Manchester, and is an uncodified constitution. And in compliance with our British law, international law in the UK is not legally binding upon us until the UK Parliament passes an Act of Parliament at a later stage. Then this is the process. The British government, on our behalf, signs an international treaty. That international treaty does not become legally binding upon us immediately. It may have moral, persuasive authority, but because we are a dualist state, which basically means the international arena is very different from the domestic arena, that international obligation will not be legally binding upon us until Westminster, at a later stage, passes an Act of Parliament. This is different from other countries, such as Spain, which is a monist system. You don't need to worry now about the terminology. But in Spain, for instance, when the Spanish president signs an international treaty, that is already legally binding upon us. We don't need a subsequent statement by the Spanish legislature. And this is a very important and striking difference between the United Kingdom and other countries. However, and I would like to convey this message very powerfully, no legal force does not mean no relevance. Why? Think of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child. Such an important document. I cannot stress, I cannot emphasize enough the significance of this document. However, it hasn't been incorporated, as we know, into English law. And nevertheless, it has important social, political, and cultural significance. And young people are now much more aware of their human rights and what is appropriate to expect or demand from society. Having said which, although this kind of social impact is powerful, certainly it would be desirable, in my humble opinion, to incorporate it into British law, because rights which can be enforced in court have even a much bigger potential to change lives. Then, having given you this introductory explanation of how our historical development has worked and what is the relationship between the United Kingdom and the international community, bearing in mind that we are a dualist state, it's time for us to focus on how rights in the United Kingdom are regulated. I think importantly, we need to stress that human rights which exist within domestic law fall into two categories. And I'm going to mainly focus on the Human Rights Act 1998 today. But I would also invite you to bear in mind that there are also rights that have been traditionally recognized in English and British law, deeply embedded, deeply rooted in the British ethos, and they are there and they shouldn't be underestimated. And sometimes they are there. Importantly, and this is something which I am always at pains to stress when I share this information with my wonderful students at the University of Manchester, who are very passionate, as you are, about constitutional law. The European Convention on Human Rights is the international document that has been incorporated into British law by the Human Rights Act. This is very important. Then, as we are a dualist state, the British government signed the European Convention of Human Rights in 1951. However, we didn't bring it home until 1998. Then what happened from 1951 to 1998? The European Convention of Human Rights had a moral or persuasive authority. But the Human Rights Act has enabled individuals to take actions against public authorities before they are national courts, here in British soil. And I think this is really important. But I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that the European Convention on Human Rights is a document enacted by the Council of Europe, which is a different institution altogether from the European Union. And I would like to stress this because we are not leaving the Council of Europe. I know we have left the European Union, but the European Union is a very different institution. Nevertheless, there is a lot of confusion in society because attacking the European Union and the Court of Strasbourg are often part of the same political mindset around retaining control of sovereignty of national affairs in Britain. And the differences couldn't be clearer. The European Union is mainly, if not exclusively, a common market. It's a financial reality, also political, social, and so on. The Council of Europe, and it has currently 27 member states. The Council of Europe, this body to which we still belong, and I would like to stress this very clearly, is a different type of organization. It focuses mainly on human rights. And as I said, for the time being at least, we are not leaving this supranational institution. The Council of Europe is also a much bigger body than the European Union in terms of membership. Every single country in Europe, except for Belarus, is part of the Council of Europe. Then think of Russia, think of Turkey, think of Norway. All those countries are not members of the European Union, but they are still part of the Council of Europe. I think this is very important to stress because, once again, we haven't left the Council of Europe and we are still legally bound, in my opinion, fortunately, I think it's great, by the European Convention on Human Rights. Then, as I told you earlier, the Human Rights Act has brought the rights set out in the European Convention into domestic law. And now, British people who live in British soil, have an opportunity to take actions and to seek the protection of their human rights, not in Strasbourg, in that beautiful city in France, as it happened before. No, that protection now must be provided here by British judges as a result of the enactment of the Human Rights Act. And the Human Rights Act basically means that public authorities will have to uphold human rights and will have to defend it. But also the state will have to take action to prevent third party from interfering with rights. Then, for instance, as I stated in this slide, the state must protect a person's right to life and freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment. Therefore, there is an obligation on the part of public authorities to have a robust system of criminal justice and policing. Also, the state must protect a person's right to freedom of belief. So, employees must have a legal remedy if their employer unreasonably restricts their religious freedom at work. As you can see, therefore, the obligations are really demanding, and it's very important, and the message is quite clearly. Human rights must be protected by the state, and also the state must enable individuals to seek and to receive the protection from the legal framework. What sort of rights are we thinking of? Let me divide them into two subcategories. I would like to discuss this matter later today with you. Some rights are absolute, such as the right to life, recognized by Article 2. However, some other rights can be limited, where there is a good reason to do so, usually because it's necessary to protect the rights of other people or the general good of society. Let me illustrate it with one example. We obviously have freedom of expression, but this does not mean that everyone can say or express whatever they like, wherever or however they choose. Some restrictions may be appropriate. And we have a criminal offense, which is hate speech. If somebody stands in the high street and encourages people to attack ethnic minorities, they will be committing a criminal offense. Then some people argue that this is very heavy-handed, but the reason why we have some restrictions of our human rights is clear. We need to protect other people. And sometimes the courts will say, yes, certainly, this is clearly a manifestation of your religion, for instance, but we need to limit it because we need to protect, for instance, children or other people in our society. Therefore, these sort of restrictions are completely compatible with our democratic credentials here in the United Kingdom. But when it comes to this matter, there is always this question which is fascinating, and I know some of you have this interest. Is there really a hierarchy of rights? Are there some rights which are more important than others? And the answer is no. I know there may well be some perceptions. Some people argue, some commentators, some colleagues of ours would argue that there is a sort of hierarchy of rights. But I would challenge that, and I would argue that it will depend on every single case. Then we'll have to look at the circumstances of that particular case, and the judges, the courts, will have to give an answer, will have to give a response, will have to provide a solution. Therefore, is there a hierarchy when it comes to right to religion and equality and prohibition of discrimination on the grounds of gender and sexual orientation and so on? No. We'll have to look at each individual case, and every case must receive or may receive a different response. And this has been something that has been conveyed very powerfully in the last few years, not only by the Court of Strasbourg in France, but also by our domestic courts. There is no hierarchy of rights, and the outcome will depend upon the unique set of facts. And this is not to be taken lightly. As I told you earlier, and because I know I would like to have this possibility to hear from you and to have a discussion, I'll obviously look at this, but I won't focus too thoroughly on this. The Human Rights Act has been an amazing piece of legislation in terms of enforcement of rights. Because prior to that, you could go to Strasbourg, but everything would depend very much on your financial resources. Then if you were well off and if you could afford it, obviously you could take the case and reach Strasbourg. But if your financial means were more limited, you didn't have those opportunities at your disposal. Importantly, however, the Human Rights Act is very, very clear about the fact that judges can issue a so-called declaration of incompatibility, if need be. But the judges in the United Kingdom, and this is very different from other countries in Europe and elsewhere, the judges in this country cannot say this act of parliament is invalid, this act of parliament is void. Why cannot they do it? Because there is a fascinating principle in British law. I am completely besotted by it. It's a very, very powerful principle, which is very different in the rest of Europe, which is the principle of parliamentary supremacy. And this shouldn't be underestimated. Then all these rights must be also, on many, many occasions, you will also be able to resort to Article 14, which is like a sort of clause of equality. The enjoyment of the rights and freedoms set forth in the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act shall be secure, and this is very important, without discrimination on any ground, such as sex, race, color, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, association with a national minority, property, birth, or other status, you name it. This is really, really powerful. But this provision requires states to have very robust equality law, and Article 14, however, can only be used alongside another convention rights. But what I would like to say is that I know the Human Rights Act is subject to a lot of criticism in the United Kingdom. Some part of the media dread it and hate it and loathe it and think it's terrible. And they always emphasize that the Human Rights Act is a piece of legislation which is benefiting criminals and people who are not very good. Well, let me just tell you that as a result of my research, what I have discovered is that the Human Rights Act is a mechanism which is really protective of people who otherwise wouldn't have a voice in our society. Then ethnic minorities, religious minorities, etc., are amongst the most staunch supporters of the Human Rights Act. I think this is very important. But also I like the fact that the Human Rights Act is such a powerful piece of legislation, because for the first time in history, the Human Rights Act puts both all of us, men and women, at the very center of the system. And we enjoy those rights, not because the state is very nice and because public authorities are very good and very supportive. No, we enjoy those rights because we are both men and women, and we enjoy those rights, and this is really powerful, irrespective of our nationality, our gender, our sexual orientation, our race. I think this is really powerful. That is why I feel, as you can see, very strongly about maintaining the Human Rights Act in our legislation. But this is basically, and I'm bringing this presentation to an end with this reflection, this is where we stand, because it remains to be seen what is going to happen with the Human Rights Act. As you can see, I have entitled this slide like the future of the Human Rights Act and common law rights. One of the former Prime Minister, David Cameron, was elected with a promise to repeal the Human Rights Act and replace it with a British Bill of Rights. There is this strong sense, and we saw it in the Brexit debate, I don't need to tell you more about it, that this piece of legislation is too alien. This piece of legislation, if I may say, is too European, is not sufficiently British. Well, I am fascinated by that debate, but I'm equally bewildered, because I don't really mind if we have to replace the Human Rights Act or if we have to rename it by a British Bill of Rights, if we maintain those rights and also we confirm our commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights, then I don't have a particular issue with renaming the Human Rights Act and regarding it as a British Bill of Rights from now onwards. But I am slightly concerned about what that exactly means and what sort of rights are we thinking of that we really don't share with the rest of Europe. Therefore, I think in lots of academic events in which we have discussed this idea of a British Bill of Rights, but academics, experts in this area are all very confused about what this would involve. It's quite confusing, I must say. It's not clear what is going to happen now. First Brexit and then COVID-19 have pushed this to be back of the agenda. Theresa May, in fact, put it on ice, saying, well, now we have Brexit, this is all very concerning, and we have other priorities. Let's see what happens. A few years down the line, Boris Johnson seems, we don't know, but seems to be quite supportive of the Human Rights Act. I mean, as you can imagine, I have strong views about our belonging to international organizations. I love the United Kingdom. I think this is a wonderful country. I chose to live here, as I shared with you in the beginning of my presentation. This is a brilliant country, but I think when it comes to human rights and areas like this, we are better together if we work with other partners such as Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and so on. Then I would feel very concerned, certainly, about leaving the Council of Europe. Because if we did so, we would become the second country in the whole of Europe, which has left, which is not member of the Council of Europe, alongside Belarus. And I'm sorry to say, I'd rather not see that scenario. Just very, very briefly, because I've told you this is the end of my presentation, because I know I was impressed by the quality of many of your questions, and you have a high level there which is commendable, and I praise you for that. And that is obviously to the credit of your teachers. But some of you will probably know that in addition to Human Rights Act, we have another branch of law completely different, which is equality law. The main piece of legislation of this second block is the Equality Act 2010. That includes areas such as age, disability, gender reassignment, and so on. This is not the scope of my presentation today, but I just thought that for the sake of coherence and for the sake of fairness on you, I needed to obviously draw your attention to the fact that in addition to the Human Rights Act, we also have another important piece of legislation. Therefore, just to sum up, the United Kingdom, we are a dualist state. We are a state in which, obviously, the fact that the UK government signs an international treaty doesn't make it legally binding upon us. We need a subsequent piece of legislation enacted by Westminster, by the British Parliament, and I have illustrated this by using the European Convention on Human Rights example that was signed by the British government in 1951, but it wasn't brought home until the Human Rights Act was passed in 1998. We are still legally bound by the European Convention on Human Rights because this is a very different legal framework from the European Union, despite the fact that the media in this country tries to confuse us all the time. Anyway, it's been a real pleasure. I can't see anyone, but I assume many of you are there. It's been an authentic, real pleasure to have you and to share this presentation with you today. Many thanks.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Javier, Garcia, Oliva, I've got to say it was a wonderful sort of impassionate sort of explanation of the bills, going through the complexities behind it. And I find it fascinating how you drew on the ideas and misconceptions in there as well, and understanding where we are right now, and perhaps a roadmap forward, and some of the key debates that will have to be had as we progress forward towards deadlines, towards Brexit and different issues there, and also defining between the difference of leaving the European Union as well and the Council there. I think is quite a key fact that I think the press in the UK perhaps haven't really picked up on and are shying away from in some ways. Now, we have some questions for you, which we'll go about in a second, and we have some live questions to start off with. I'm going to bring online, first of all, Amelia Collett, and she's going to put a camera on a second, and I'm going to try and make sure she's live with you. Amelia, you are live now in the lecture series. Have you got a question to ask, first of all?
Hi, thank you so much for delivering this lecture today. It's been really interesting. Thank you. My question is, are international human rights recognised regardless of international cultural differences?
Excellent, Amelia. I think this is thank you for your very kind words. I guess when it comes to these matters, as I said, despite the fact that we have some common norms and principles that all countries in the world share, we know that one of the problems of the United Nations is the lack of legal enforceability. I do very much remember that when I studied, when I was an undergraduate student, my lecturer in public international law was rather defensive. He started the presentation saying, international law is really law. It's something that really needs to be defended and upheld, and is very important. But as I mentioned, I'm sorry to say at the beginning of my presentation, the fulfillment of these rights is going to depend very much on the goodwill of the member state. Then I think, I don't want to be Eurocentric here. I think that would be very snobbish on our part, but I think it's going to depend very much, I'm afraid to say, on the part of the globe where we live. Here in Europe, we have an extremely sophisticated model of protection of rights, and I think there is a clear recognition that human rights must be upheld and respected widely. Sadly, the same may not be applicable to other parts of the world necessarily. There are other parts of the world that the fulfillment of which is as good as here. But in that sense, what we have here in the European context, the European Convention on Human Rights, is probably one of the most sophisticated mechanisms for the protection of human rights. Then to sum it up, going back to your question, it depends very much on the culture and the geographical area where we're looking at.
It's a great question. Thank you for that. I'm actually going to go to another live question at the same time. I'll start with our camera feeds first of all. So I know I've got waiting. Well, another Amelia Sharples is also online, and I know she's going to put a camera on a second and ask you a question. And we'll try and get Amelia to be coming in live to us at the same time. Amelia, nice to see you. How are you?
Nice to see you too. I'm very good, thank you.
Have you got a question as well?
I do. Just firstly, thank you so much for your engaging topic that is so interesting and important currently in these strange and unusual times. So my question is, what are your thoughts on prisoners serving custodial sentences voting rights according to the European Convention on Human Rights? Thank you.
Yeah, Amelia, that's a very sophisticated question. And it's one of the areas I discuss with my students at Manchester. You know, there has been this ongoing controversy between the British government and the European Court of Human Rights that has now been settled. I think it was misinterpreted in many British circles. I think the bottom line was, or the message coming from the Court of Strasbourg was like a blanket policy was not compatible with the convention, just stating prisoners can never under any circumstances vote. Then the European Court of Human Rights was keen on seeing a mechanism in which probably some people wouldn't be entitled to vote, but some other people, particularly those who had been punished for smaller crimes, would also be in a position to vote. Despite, or in addition to this controversy that I have just shared with you, I genuinely think this is the real issue that we need to face. I have illustrated, I have given you a few examples throughout my presentations about how human rights are beneficial to people like you, or Mr. Shaw, or myself, and also lots of law-abiding citizens. I think that that important aspect is somehow overlooked by important members of our society and the media on many, many occasions. But at the very end of the day, also those people who we don't like very much and who probably are not very kind and very nice to others, they need to be, obviously, they need to receive a sentence and they need to be punished, but they are, at the end of the day, also human rights. Then human rights are also addressed to people who are not very likable, people who are not very kind. Then we could have a completely different model, a completely different system in which if you make a mistake, we just punish you forever and we get rid of you. But this is not what happens in democracies like ours, like the United Kingdom. Then when people get very upset about the fact that prisoners have some rights, we need to differentiate. What sort of prisoner? I agree, I would feel absolutely horrified if somebody who is a serial killer is given the right. But it's very different if you are in prison for something relatively minor. And I think that was the message from Strasbourg. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that. I think it's a really good answer to the question as well. Very interesting. Now we've got a number of questions that have been sent in by different students. Probably lots to try and get through, so we won't cover them all, but we'll try and get a few in there. I'm going to go straight in now. We talked about sort of criminals there in that last question. One question been sent in is about if a crime occurs in a different country to the individual citizenship, are their human rights the same as they would have been in their own country?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Shaw. That's a very, very, very good question. Importantly, we do not follow, when it comes to this matter, the principle of personality, which is basically the nationality of the perpetrator, but we are looking at the principle of territoriality. In other words, where is the crime committed or perpetrated? Consequently, where in Rome, do what the Romans do, legally speaking, and also on a day-to-day basis. If you are living in Spain, you will have to follow the law of the Kingdom of Spain. If you live in France, you will have to follow the rules of the Republic of France. When I came to the United Kingdom, it's not only I am absolutely privileged to live here, and therefore I embrace the British legal framework, but it's not only because I have to do it, it's also because I think it's really, really important that we do it. And in addition to embracing the legal framework, another important element here is embracing the constitutional culture of that particular country. And this is a topic for another date, because I'm fascinated by the whole idea of the British constitutional culture, and we can discuss it on another occasion. No, therefore, if you are a British citizen and you commit a crime in Pakistan or in France or in Spain, you will be judged in accordance with their legal orders.
It's very clear. Thank you for that as well. And lots we could go into. There's perhaps a further lecture around that topic coming down the line. There's a lot to cover as well.
I would love to come back.
I mean, one thing you mentioned in your talk was about one of your areas about looking at religion and human rights. And one of the questions we received was, how are human rights affected by religion? That's a big one too.
Yeah, that's a biggie, actually. It's a very big question, but it's something I have devoted quite a few years to that of my life. Now, I'll try not to spend too many hours now, but only a couple of minutes. Well, I think importantly, and this is something which is lost in some quite anti-religious circles that we have in the UK and elsewhere. I'm not going to say that the influence of religion has always been brilliant, but I would say the United Kingdom legal framework is a clear example, and this is something I have worked with my co-author Helen Hall, who happens to be attending this presentation actually. And our research has taken us to the following acknowledgement. The legal and political framework of the United Kingdom favors religion and regards religion as a benign force for our society. Then this is one issue. And then I would like to link it with your question, Mr. Shaw. Then religion has been absolutely vital in the establishment of human rights in our societies. Let's not forget it. Let me just illustrate it with a couple of examples. I mean, the ideas of thinkers such as Francisco de Vitoria, members of different Roman Catholic religious orders in the 16th century, were absolutely vital for the development of human rights as we know them today. Also, if you look at the way criminals are dealt with by canon law, the law of the Roman Catholic Church, but also shared by other denominations such as the Church of England and the Church in Wales, etc., really changed the approach to criminals. In Roman law, historically, criminals obviously needed to be punished, no forgiveness, generally speaking. Canon law came with this idea of reconciliation. And this is the whole idea of rehabilitation that we have in our criminal system today. That comes from Christianity and Judaism. And sometimes we tend to forget it. Then this is the very positive side of religion. However, I suspect that the question is also looking at what happens nowadays when we see some religious bodies which are really challenging the significance of some human rights. And then I feel equally uneasy about it. I do understand that, and this is an area that I have researched for a very long time, and there are many, many examples now. And the typical conflict, Mr. Shaw, as you know, is the one now between freedom of religion on the one hand and prohibition of discrimination on the grounds of either gender or sexual orientation. Then what happens if I am a registrar and I need to celebrate a wedding, and because of my religious views, I don't think I can celebrate a same-sex marriage? Should that be given priority, or should the right of the couple not to be obviously treated less favorably, not to be discriminated against, etc., should that be given preference? It's a fascinating debate, and I know that the responses of the courts cannot satisfy everyone.
I think you're right, and there really is a whole debate around that sort of dilemma and perhaps moral dilemmas that people face in their lives as they come across this, and it's very, very interesting. I'm going to go on to some questions from some younger people now that came in. This is what I thought would come in when the title came out. This one's from Maxim, he's in the year 10, and he's obviously picked up on the current news around Black Lives Matter, which is very prominent in the press at the moment and around the world, and he's probably seen the football clubs taking a knee at the right time, and it's gained a lot of media attention and a very prominent time. And I think Maxim is asking what your thoughts are on the Black Lives Matter movement and how might that affect education in the future?
Well, I think it goes without saying. Sorry, what's the name of the student again? Matt?
That's Maxim.
Maxim. Yeah, thank you, Maxim, for your question. I think it's a really, really important question. And I feel very, very humble, and I feel very hopeful about the future of humankind when I see people your age obviously challenging this prejudice and this discrimination against people on the grounds of, on many different grounds, but particularly now we are talking about their race. Having said which, I felt extremely uncomfortable about the whole process with the demonstrations. I think the aims couldn't be more commendable. I challenge and I combat, and I think racism is a cancer and we really need to deal with it. But in the current climate, with all the problems about the pandemic, I think it was utterly irresponsible because of all the risk involved. I do understand the passion of young people. I sympathize. I feel that we are really, really fortunate to have people with your ideals and your dreams. And I think this is what our society needs, but that was a bit risky. The other thing I would like to say, however, is that racial discrimination is not the only evil that we have in our society. It's a terrible evil, and we need to handle it and to deal with it very robustly. But we also need to combat discrimination on the grounds of gender, discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, and so on. And what my co-author and I realized, and this is really, really thought-provoking, and I wanted to share it with you, is that on many occasions we carried out more than 100 interviews for our research. And we interviewed people of a plethora, a wide range of backgrounds. And some people, obviously, on the diverse people in terms of races, sexual orientation, gender, religion, origin, and so on. And even though, obviously, the vast majority of people wanted to combat discrimination full stop, there were also quite a few people we found that were just concerned about their particular characteristic. They were very, very furious about racism, but they were not so concerned about Islamophobia or homophobia. And this is what we need to tackle. And I think we need to give a proper response here. We need to overcome this prejudice, and obviously I share the views of the Black Lives Matter, but I also share the views that there are many more things we need to address in addition to racial discrimination in our society.
It's really helpful. Thank you for that. And I mean, one of the students, Garcia, mentions a question, which I won't go to just now, about the idea between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And I guess sometimes in your response there, if I'm right, you're saying that, you know, it's right to have that passion about your own sort of what you feel passionate about and to go about that. But actually, is it a springboard to say, well, you know, all lives matter? We should have this for all areas, and there should be no prejudice towards any area on here, and to focus on human rights. Is that correct? What you think, or?
Yes, Mr. Show, I think that's a fantastic summary of this point. I don't think we should underestimate for 1 second the systemic prejudice of Black people. Let's, however, at the same time, I think we need to be aware of the cultural differences. I think this is really, really interesting. I mean, as a matter of curiosity, if I, for the purposes of the census here in the United Kingdom, myself as a continental European, as a Latin person, I am regarded as white. However, in the United States of America, I would have to choose this label of Hispanic or Latin. Therefore, it's interesting how we have cultural nuances and subtleties that we need to bear in mind. I don't want us to become unduly complacent in the United Kingdom. I'm not saying that there's no racism in the UK. There is. My experience as somebody with this foreign accent coming to British academia, and the accent will never go, obviously, because I've been here for 20 years now. And as you were referring to, Mr. Shaw, at the beginning of the presentation. But as somebody who has been in the United Kingdom for 20 years, and this is not because I want you to invite me to your school in the future, and I am just praising you for the sake of doing it. I say it in my lectures a lot. I think generally speaking, and I love the fact that British people are generally speaking extremely humble, and the fact that showing off is regarded as very tacky in this country. I love it. At the same time, I think we need to be aware of our strengths. I say this because I now feel I belong to this society after all these years. And one of our strengths is that, generally speaking, we are a very tolerant, pluralistic, embracing society, and that has been my experience. Then let's deal with those minorities who don't fit into this framework I have just described. Let's combat, obviously, racism. Let's combat anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, xenophobia, all these evils. But let's not fall into this very pessimistic view of humankind in the UK, because I think, generally speaking, the UK is a wonderful country in all these matters.
I guess in some ways the UK has got a chance to shine a torch brightly and to be the ones that stand up and be the example, which we'd be very proud to do in many ways.
Yeah.
And as we tackle these issues, and we are absolutely real that you know, these issues happen in society, but they can also happen in schools and education. And clearly, I know the university and ourselves are very committed to rising up against that in many ways. I do appreciate the charters that the university has as well. One of the questions that came through that we had was about, there's a lot of talk about the apps coming out for perhaps tracking and tracing apps. And I think one of our students has looked at that as well. And they put a question in saying, with the new age of intelligence, MI5, looking at privacy online, do you think this starts to cross a line with our human rights or privacy?
Well, I think we need to be very robust about the protection of our rights. And of course, I think, generally speaking, there is a concern that some companies are going to be very interested in our data. And I guess this is my main concern about these massive companies, Mr. Shaw, that may be very interested in all this data. And I'm not going to name them because we all know, but we are all part of the process. And I think that is my main concern, to what extent we are losing part of the confidentiality of that information, which must necessarily be protected. I think MI5 probably has different concerns, rather than knowing what religion or what films we watch and so on. They may be interested in what we do. I'm not underestimating it, but I think, generally speaking, I'm much more concerned, and this is a fascinating, very good question. What was the name of the student again?
I don't have the name in front of me. It's coming sent in, so I apologize, but I'll find out.
No.
I'll find out.
Just to thank her, because it's very, I'm not particularly worried about MI5 learning my data, but I am much more concerned about these massive multinational companies that may have a much stronger interest in them.
It's really interesting, actually. So it's making sure we're aware of that, and we're aware of our privacy, we're aware of our data, how it's being used, and perhaps I think what we all encourage is for people to keep questioning and to ask the question why. So if we are sending data out there, what's the purpose behind it? What's it being used for? And is it justified? I know time's running on, and we're heading past sort of 3 o'clock right now. We're doing great to go through. I think a question from all of us here and from the school and from our pupils was about, do you think that human rights should be taught more strongly, perhaps in schools and education?
Well, I think it's a very important area. I think they need to be, and I'm absolutely delighted that you agreed with my statement about all the confusion, because I felt very, very concerned during the whole Brexit debate when I heard some very distinguished or well-known politicians in the British context just saying, we just can't tolerate these judgments coming from Strasbourg and telling us what to do. And I saw people, and this is something which is probably, I obviously disagree with the 52% of people who voted to leave, but I think labeling that 52% of people as just racist and xenophobes is completely inaccurate, and it's not doing us any favor. There were many reasons and very different reasons why people voted to leave. And I just felt extremely sorry, obviously, to see some people in different interviews just saying, no, I just want to leave because I can't really tolerate this idea of prisoners having rights. Then I would like to bring it back to your question, therefore. I think it would be fundamental to have this sort of lessons in schools, because it's one of my challenges as a law academic. And I don't blame it on my students, because the sort of students we get in Manchester are absolutely brilliant students as the sort of students you have in your very distinguished school, and they are brilliant, and they're really kind, and they're clever, but more importantly, they're really decent human beings. And I have to spend a lot of time on differentiating, making a distinction between the European Union and the Council of Europe. And unfortunately, it's still the case that by the end of the third year, there are still some students who who don't get it right. The vast majority, they do. But I don't blame it on our students, because I think we are in a culture in which obviously all this is mixed up and there is a lot of confusion. And I think the media should be very responsible when it comes to these matters. Then should our schools be part of that process? Certainly. If schools could help us, if schools could really teach human rights thoroughly, it would make because many people learn those differences in Manchester University when they study law. But if you study chemistry or biology, it's going to be different. But I guess you focus at secondary school level on human rights, don't you? And you explain them.
Absolutely right. And I think it's very important to go through that. And I think one thing that on your slides that came up was the rights of the child.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we are extremely passionate about. As a school, and we try and share that, and we'd love to share that broadly, globally as well, because it's something that I think perhaps isn't so much on the agenda of the education at the moment, and it could be more so in the forefront of that, and making children aware of the rights of the child when it came out as well. I'd like to move towards a sort of a part closure, I guess, in some ways, but there are people tuned in today watching this because they're passionate about human rights, and they're also passionate about law. And they're probably going through their education. They may be aged 13, 14, they could be younger than that as well. And if they've heard this lecture, this talk online today, and the dialogue, and they've obviously heard your passion coming through, you're presenting different views, some might agree with, some might want to argue, but actually academia is part of that, because they will put things together and look at journals and research, and your life has been committed towards researching those areas. What would you say to somebody who's tuning into this and they become really enthused by the way you're talking and they're interested in the detail of the legal aspect? What could they do to become more interested in this and perhaps go on to aspire to be at a university or to go beyond that? What's your kind of advice for them?
No, that's excellent. I have to say, I'm unsure, because I can tell by this conversation that we have had, and also in the minutes that we shared prior to this discussion, that you are very passionate about what you do, Mr. Shaw, and I feel exactly the same. And I am very, very fortunate. And I'm not saying this. Every single morning I get up and I just think, I'm really doing what I love. Then I do remember when I was obviously your age, and I'm referring to those pupils who are here. We're talking about 14, 15, 16, even younger. And it's always very daunting making a decision like this. What should I do? I tell you what, I doubted. I thought of doing politics, and I always liked foreign languages. I thought of doing English and even Spanish and history. And I finally chose law. And I haven't regretted it one single second of my life. And the reason being is this is the most exciting subject. Well, I'm sure other people will say the same about their own background and academic background. But I just find law such an exciting tool in order to give a response to people's needs, which is really, whenever I give open days or visit days at the University of Manchester, I always emphasize the idea that whoever tells you that law is boring is just lying. Law couldn't be more exciting. I cannot guarantee that every single lecture in this lecture, the object, not the individuals, is going to be absolutely vibrant and exciting. But I can assure you that on the whole, and this is our experience at the University of Manchester, people end up loving it. Then if you are thinking about doing law, you are very, very welcome to email me and Javier Oliva. You can send me an email. And if you wish to visit the University of Manchester and have a conversation with me and some of my colleagues, I would be absolutely delighted. I think, obviously, you have a wide range of choices ahead of you. Law is not the only thing. There are many other exciting careers or avenues. But I can assure you that if you study law, you will not regret it. It's just, I'm completely besotted by my profession every single day. Then I hope whatever you choose in life, and if you decide not to do law, amazing, fantastic. There are many other options in life, but make sure you choose something which is in your heart, because you have to live every single day. And I know some people tell me, oh, job is just something you have to do to get a salary. That's a very sad way to live, because you have to spend sometimes more than 8 hours every single day on that. Choose something you are passionate about.
Well, that's a very important message, and I echo that, and I think the students will know that I would say the same thing to them, is that when you find that combination of something that you have a gift towards and you're good at and you're passionate about, something magical happens and that spark ignites and you're taking on that journey of exploration in yourself academically, but also enjoying it as well. And there are hard days at work and you've got to put the time into it, but if you enjoy what you're doing, that will push you on through. I've got to say to Dr. Javier, Garcia, Oliva, thank you so much for what you've done there, and your passion clearly came through, and to put an invitation out to visit you at the university is a fantastic offer as well, and we do appreciate that. I think if it was your lectures that I'm seeing there, the passion you study wasn't boring, I'd imagine you get a lot of content coming through. I really appreciate your time today and being here and sharing your wisdom, your research and your life experience as well. And there's one final question from me which I haven't forgotten about, which is, which football club do you follow?
But you know, I just wanted to be very diplomatic, because whatever I say is going to be divisive, but yes, I support Manchester United. Sorry, I don't know whether that's yours or not, but
no, that's fine. You're going to get some interesting reactions from that one, some good reactions as well. But I'm sure it's the right club to follow. It's been a tough time right now. It's
going to, and with this pandemic, it's been a difficult year for those of us who follow sports also. But things are back to normal. I wish all of us are safe and going back to a sort of normality in the next few months. And thank you, Mr. Show, for your, I mean, you're a brilliant chair, I have to say, not to flatter you. You are brilliant, and I've been absolutely delighted to meet you, your colleagues, and to get these fantastic questions from your students. And if you wish to contact me, by all means, you can do it at any time. I'll be delighted to welcome you at the University of Manchester.
Wonderful. So thank you to yourself, and thank you to all the students taking part, and for the many questions that were sent in. We couldn't get round to all of them. We'll hopefully see you soon at our next event. We have some more lectures planned as well. And of course, we'll be doing a global classroom event coming up on the 9th of July. We focus on mental well-being and having one global mind as we go through this. So from my point of view, it's goodbye from the school. And thank you very much, Dr. Javier, Garcia, Oliva. We'll see you all soon. Take care and goodbye.